Hello, everyone. For the February podcast, we'll be discussing the Kevin Bailey case. My name is Julia, and I am the president for UTMMJ. I'm a third-year student in the Forensic Psychology program. I'm joined here with Jacob and Jordi. Jacob, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. So I'm Jacob, the club's admin associate. I'm in my third year. I'm majoring in history, and I'll pass it over to Jordi.
Hi everyone, my name is Jordi. I'm the VP Finance for UTMMJ, and I'm also a third-year student. I'm doing a double major in biology for health science and forensic science.
Cool. All right. So we'll jump right into it. Jacob, do you mind telling us a little about the case?
Sure. So the incident in question happened in 1989. So Kevin Bailey and his friend were wrongly accused of murder. So this ends up happening. They were found guilty in 1991 during the trial. The incident that they're accused of was the murder of Lume Woods, who was the wife of a retired police officer from Chicago. So in that process, there's a whole bunch of incidents that happen, which we'll discuss later in the podcast. But it's not until 2018 that Kevin Bailey is actually exonerated. So he ends up spending 28 years in prison for a crime he did not actually commit.
Wow. And Jordi, can you highlight areas that went wrong in this case?
Yeah, so obviously the key issue in this case was the interrogation process, whereby the police used coercion tactics on these two young 19-year-old boys. So they were held in the interrogation room for several hours. In the case of Batchelor, he was there for 24 hours, and he was violently abused in the interrogation room. He was kicked, choked, slammed against a wall, and like I said, this went on for about 24 hours. While in the case of Kevin Bailey, he was held for around 12 hours, and he eventually gave a false confession when the police officer grabbed him by his neck and threatened his life.
So Jordi, why did these false confessions happen?
Yeah, so false confessions can happen for a bunch of different reasons, but in this case, it was due to the coercion tactics used by the police. So coercion tactics are any act that elicits a false response from a suspect. In this case, it was two 19-year-old boys, and it was done through violent means. So there was an interesting psychology article which I read, which gave a bit more insight into the false confession. So they tend to happen when there are long, intense interrogations. And what you usually see is that the police or detective or whoever it is using these coercion tactics, they tend to repeat the accusations to the suspect who committed the crime. They tend to discredit the suspect's denials. They fabricate evidence, for example, saying an eyewitness saw you do it. And what they do is they repress the memory of the suspect. So they try to discredit any real experiences or any real fact that the suspect tries to give. And so yeah, that's what would have happened in this case. The violence would have been the reason as to why these two individuals gave their false confessions in order to prevent any further abuse.
So interestingly enough, this actually happens in Chicago during the John Berg era. So for those of you who don't know, John Berg, who was actually a veteran from the Vietnam War, he worked his way up the Chicago police ranks in the 1970s and 80s, eventually becoming one of the top detectives. So during that point in time, he was a very important person and kind of worked with a lot of the other detectives, training them on methods for interrogations and just general police work. And as a result of that, a lot of the torture, which is seen in the Bailey case and many other cases, is a result of John Berg's kind of underhanded and very vile tactics. So he's also more recently been put on trial himself for the things that he was responsible for while he was a detective, and even going as far as having a lot of death row inmates who were confessed under his jurisdiction. They've even been pardoned. So there's a lot of information you can look up about John Berg, and I believe it's the Chicago Tribune has a really good timeline about the events that kind of happened around his time.
Yeah, interesting enough, another method police like to use to instigate confessions is through a procedure called Mr. Big. Essentially, it's undercover police eliciting confessions from suspects. So, for example, police create a fake organized crime and they pay suspects for doing small illegal tasks. They're told that to be promoted in the organization and to make more money, they'll need to attend an interview with Mr. Big himself, and they should impress Mr. Big. Mr. Big will ask about their prior criminal history in hopes to get a confession, because of course Mr. Big is a undercover police. And while the suspect is under the impression that it's an interview. So obviously there's some issues and ethical wrongdoings with this procedure. And Jacob, can you point us to a few cases that have used the Mr. Big method?
Yeah, for sure. So in Canada, there's two landmark cases. They're actually pretty recent in 2014. So the first case is R.V. Hart. So Hart was actually a suspect in the drowning of his two daughters. So shortly after the crime was committed, a Mr. Big sting was initiated against Hart. So essentially, like Julia had explained, he was kind of brought into this criminal organization and tricked into believing that he was working for like a large syndicate. At the time, he was getting paid pretty well, and he needed an income, so this is problematic. We'll discuss in a little bit. So eventually, they did get a confession out of Hart that he said that he was responsible for the death of his two kids. However, upon going to court, Hart was found guilty for the crime, but during his during the appeal, Hart was actually found to be, his confession was found to be problematic considering that he needed the income, and it was, a lot of the facts that were brought up were already public knowledge. So this brings us to the R.V. Mack case, where Mack was accused of murdering his roommate. But in this case, it was more the facts that were brought up during his confession were things that only police would have known. It wasn't public knowledge. So this kind of gave the jury as well as the judge kind of some sound knowledge that it was something else that was happening here, and it wasn't just kind of a coerced confession. This led to a two-pronged proof, which essentially you needed to kind of convince the jury that it wasn't just something that police were feeding the suspect, especially in the Canadian courts where you have to have that burden of proof to make sure it's beyond a reasonable doubt. So, Jordi, what do you think we can do to minimize these false confessions?
Yeah, there are actually a few, when you think about it, really simple steps that police and detectives can take to minimize false confession. So, firstly, and one of the most important ones, as we could see in this case, no threats or violence to be used in interrogation. And I mean that's self-explanatory. You won't get a true confession out of someone if you have a gun to their head or you have a hand around their neck. Another thing is to avoid long interrogations as much as possible. In some cases, obviously, you can't avoid it, but it's important in that case then to give breaks so that everyone has time to collect their thoughts and really understand what they're going through. Another thing, again, also relevant to this case, is to ensure that juveniles or persons with mental impairment have proper representation throughout the interview process. It's important that they have proper knowledge about the judicial and legal process and any consequences which they may face from either pleading guilty or not guilty or confessing or not confessing. And so ultimately, all these reasons, it comes down to ensuring that police are properly trained in order to handle these interrogation processes. And I think that's the way going forward in order to prevent false confessions as much as possible.
Yeah, and I think it's important to tie it all together is that the environment in which the suspects are being interrogated in needs to be a safe space, and that also ensures that the confessions that we get are true of validity, and that we minimize these false confessions. Jacob, I found the Hart case really interesting. And now that I'm thinking about it, I actually remember that there are many podcasts, one being the Canadian True Crime, that actually talked about this podcast in detail for folks that are interested in it.
Yeah, so especially with like the Hart and Mack cases, they both happened in Canadian courts. So they're really easy to kind of access and get more information about. There's also quite a few papers written about them. So they're really popular cases now. Like I said, they're kind of landmark Canadian cases for the Mr. Big trials. So that's definitely something everyone can check out. And I'd like to thank everyone for chatting today, and we hope that the audience learned something new, and definitely check out some of our resources for more information.